The reason why I'm here today and why I'm supposed to come is that I'm a new faculty member at the University of Winnipeg. I've been there for 2.5 years now, and I've finally got myself settled in the southernmost tip of Canada, and I am trying to now make new connections in the United States and with my colleagues in a more local area. So today I'm going to talk about an evolving field of art production called bioart. The subtitle is Interdisciplinarity is Interference, which is one of the ways that I quite often describe what I do in a more humanities-based perspective. Bioart as a field that really challenges the borders and the parameters between the hard sciences and the humanities. So I'd like to start very briefly by giving you an introduction to what bioart is. Bioart is still a contested term, okay? So it's a field of art production that historians have charted back to 1936 in Edward Steechen's exhibition of live delphiniums at MoMA. But in addition to that, bioart has been sort of actively used as a term since the late 1980s, and people are sort of arguing about what its parameters are and how we define bioart. But bioart can be seen as an umbrella term to describe genetic art, transgenic art, biotech art, vivo arts, live art, life art, ecological art, land art, and eco art. And by some definitions, people have retroactively applied the term bioart to performance art and bioart, or body art. And the reason for that is that bioart is generally a field where the media of art production is living media, okay, it's biological media. And according to that definition, some people have retroactively imagined that the human body could also be seen as a form of bioart. So there's sort of a variety of camps. Some people see bioart as a mode of production where the media is life or living systems. Some people are more focused on bioart as one that uses the tools of biological sciences in the production of artwork. But the sort of group that I'm most closely aligned to see bioart as exploring the parameters of life in the production of art. And that can include life and living systems, it can include biological sciences, but it can also include recently deceased specimens. The bioart itself as a term, I want you to really understand that it is not only a hybrid term between art and science, but it is also proliferating a mutant term. And we can talk about that in the sense of its historical push, but we can also think about bioart as a term that describes the manipulation of life. And as biotechnology is mutating, so is the understanding of what bioart might be. There are a few sort of key parameters I'd like you to understand that bioart is not. Bioart is not art that represents life. So paintings of biotechnology or life forms would not be bioart. Only work that actually uses those life forms in its production. The other thing that bioart is not artificial life, although I would argue there's a lot of debate on that front. Bioart is not intrinsically the documentation of the art, sort of the dry photographic prints that describe the life art. Some people would argue that bioart is not body art or food art or ecological art. Again, like I said, it's sort of a contested term. But there's one thing that we can all agree upon, and that is that bioart is not science. And the reason for that is that science is a methodology that really requires rigorous, objective sort of investigations, experimental models that should be reproducible in terms of their results. And bioart is quite often the opposite of that. It's very messy and unruly and full of happenstance and mistakes, and it doesn't matter to us if we can do it again and again and again. Okay? Another thing I would say from my perspective is that bioart is intrinsically political. This is Stuart Bunt from the University of Western Australia, one of the scientists that started one of the first bioart research centers in the world. And he talks about the politics of fear as it relates to biotechnology and the understanding that these technologies, or the imagining that these technologies, when used by non-specialists, could somehow be dangerous. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Certainly there are some areas that, I would argue non-specialists or artists should probably not be involved in, nuclear technology. But a lot of our perception from outside of the hard sciences is that anything that's biological is intrinsically difficult and dangerous and belongs to a specialist class. And I would argue that by artists working in the biological sciences, that is intrinsically a sort of political incursion on those systems of authority and power. As I stated in my abstract, I like to use Edward Said as a sort of benchmark for understanding what I might be doing as an artist working within the life sciences as a form of extreme interdisciplinarity, as a form of interference that allows for sort of a critical realignment of hierarchies that we understand when we're imagining the hard sciences in the public sphere. So I'll give you an example of a few bioartists. This is sort of the talk that I give when there's people in the room who maybe have never seen bioart before we get into some of my own work. This is George Gessert. He's considered the grandfather of bioart. He started working around the 1980s, and he is a kind and gentle man. He is engaged in plant breeding as a form of art production. And in particular, these are the results of a project called Natural Selection that he's been doing for over 10 years, where he purposely breeds plants in opposition to plant breeding aesthetics. So what he does is he joins the local plant organization, and he sort of studies up on what their criteria is for a beautiful plant. And he would argue, for example, that the red rose has created a form of sort of eugenic manipulation of flowering plants in Western culture towards this one ideal of what a good plant looks like. So then what he does is he goes back and easily breeds his plants towards the opposite qualities. So this iris here on the left that you and I think is probably quite lovely is an atrocity in flower breeding circles. And then he'll book like a booth at one of their fairs and set up all of his irises and display them. And people are sort of mortified to see that he's gone to such a wrinkly edge and blue and these sort of things that to us are quite lovely are really quite heinous in those circles. Bioart does intrinsically involve ethical considerations not afforded to other light or art forms. When you are painting with paint, certainly there is you might want to find out who manufactured your paint and under what circumstances to understand what ethical considerations are involved in that. But in my field, there's intrinsically a human and animal research ethics component that is not only necessary for the artist to engage in themselves in order to complete their work in an ethical fashion, but also that becomes part of the content of the work for the viewer. Okay? So on the left here we have a Chinese artist who does work where he has tattoos placed on live pigs, and after their demise, those pigs are flayed and the skins are sold as artworks. In the center we have Victimless Leather, which is by Tissue Culture and Art Project, which is Oran Katsunya Zer from Australia. And they have a project where they're growing quote-unquote victimless leather. They have live animal cells growing on the little coat you can see inside of the orb there. And quite often animal rights groups will argue that tissue culture and tissue engineering is an ethical source of animal cells outside of living organisms. But in actuality, in order to keep that little coat alive, they are having to use serum from a variety of calves. Probably more calf byproducts going to that little coat than there would have been taken from an original calf.
Yeah, but it's actually growing? Or
it's actually growing. And I've done some of this work. I'll show you later on how it goes. It's really interesting. Selleck is on the right. He's a very famous international performance and body artist and a good friend and colleague of mine. And this is a project called The Third Year, where he became interested in growing a third year on his body. Now, there's been a number of unsuccessful attempts at this and some hospital trips for him. But at this stage, he's got a bioabsorbable polymer that he's worked with surgeons to have inserted into his arm, and it is now taken on health in a healthy way. So the next step is he's working with a group of surgeons to have a speaker put inside of his ear so that the viewer, when they see the ear on his arm, the ear will speak to them rather than listen to them.
well,
And that will eventually be hooked up to a website where viewers and users can type or communicate verbally through the website, and that what the user puts in will come out of his ear regardless of where he is and what he is doing.